Hi, I'm Chris Jepson, president of the Orange County Historical Society. Last year, 2019, we celebrated our centennial anniversary, and we had a year full of great programs and events and all sorts of special stuff going on, and we capped all of that at the end of the year with a big centennial gala dinner, and up in Fullerton at the Elks Lodge. And our speaker, as he had been many times at so many events and meetings, was Orange County historian Phil Brigandi, my friend and mentor. And he spoke about the history of the society itself. It was called A Century of History, was the program title. And I was at the time running around like a chicken with my head cut off, not only emceeing that whole evening and making sure all the wheels didn't come off the bus, even though most of the evening was put together by Monica Ortez, was kind of leading the charge. There was a lot for all of the board members to do that evening. And unfortunately, all I was able to capture of Phil's program on video, I captured, well, a little more than half of it, just shooting it with my phone from the back of the room when I had time. But it came out really pretty well. It came out clearly, and it's a great program. And of course, what we couldn't have known then was that it would be Phil's last program for the Orange County Historical Society, as he passed away on December 12th of last year. And so with that in mind, I thought, I was going to put up what I had captured of his program that night online. And that was fine, except it's all sort of out of context because I missed the first part of it. I missed a few pieces in the middle. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the missing pieces of the program here, present that to you myself, and then we will intercut my little pieces like that with the whole of Phil's program as it was recorded. So with that, this is A Century of History, presented at the Orange County Historical Society's Centennial Gala on September 14th, 2019 by Phil Brigandi. A century after its founding, the Orange County Historical Society itself has become a historical institution. Over the decades, it has shared, preserved, celebrated, and encapsulated much of the history of Orange County. Founded at a time when the pioneers were fast passing away, it reflected the county's growing self-awareness of its place in the larger story of the history of California. And while, like many older institutions here, it faltered during the dark days of World War II and lay dormant during the hectic boom of the 1950s, when much of local life seemed to be focused on just keeping up with the pace of change, it was revived in the 1960s by people who still believed that our local history has value. For me, at least, it is breathtaking to think of the pioneers who were part of the Historical Society in the early days and the programs they were able to present. Where today we might have a historian come and give a presentation on the history of some local community, they were able to hear the actual founders of these communities share their recollections. George Ameridge, who co-founded Fullerton in 1887, spoke on 3 different occasions. Colonel Solomon H. Finley spoke on his role in the founding of Pacific City, or I guess I should say Huntington Beach. And Albert Bradford, who laid out old downtown Placentia in 1910, spoke on the development of the citrus industry. Like any institution, the story of the Orange County Historical Society is really the story of the individuals who have been part of the society over the years. They were pioneers, old-timers, those are 2 different things, historians, civic leaders, and most anyone who felt a connection to Orange County's past. The pioneers, of course, are those who came first, who did first. It is appropriate, then, that the very first speaker was one of Orange County's oldest American settlers, Judge Joseph E. Pleasants, who first visited the area in 1859. In fact, he was invited to speak almost once a year throughout the 1920s. Judge Pleasance was a 49er, having come across the prairies with his family at age 10. He spoke about that in 1925 and again in 1928. He was a rancher and a beekeeper in the Santa Ana Mountains for almost 70 years and could share first-hand memories of the Camino Real, the earliest days of Anaheim, and Juan Flores' raid on San Juan Capistrano in 1857. He was in the crowd when Flores was hanged in Los Angeles that year. He remained active in the Orange County Historical Society until his death in 1934 at age 95. Looking over the list of our earlier speakers, I find many notable names. Sam Armour, one of our original county supervisors, spoke in 1921, and from what I know about Sam, he probably went on for at least an hour or two. A year later, A.D. Bishop spoke on pioneer experiences in citrus growing, and he was a citrus pioneer, having come here in 1882 when most people were still growing grain and grapes. And speaking of citrus, I might add that Charles C. Chapman, the father of the Valencia, spoke before this Historical Society several times and was our only life member in the early days. It cost about $50 back then. Chapman was also the first mayor of Fullerton and the namesake of Chapman University in Orange. We also heard from the children of the pioneers. Carrie McFadden Ford, whose family came to the Santa Ana Canyon in 1869, spoke twice. Joe Thurston, whose family settled in Aliso Canyon in 1871, spoke. Maybe you've read his book, Laguna Beach of Early Days.
We also heard about early Laguna from Josephine Yock, whose father, Joe Yock, ran the Hotel Laguna. From up in the canyons came Ann Robinson, who spoke on sketches of the early settlers of Trabuco Canyon. Her family's old home is now the community of
Robinson Ranch in Rancho Santa Margarita. Lynn Harvey,
who lived in Silverado during the boom days of the 1870s, shared some of his recollections more than half a century later. And in 1932, Louis Moulton's daughter, Charlotte, presented a historical sketch of Old El Toro, which was the supply town for the Moulton Ranch. And I haven't got time to tell you all the modern communities that were once a part of the Moulton Ranch. Of course, I'm most interested in the early historians who spoke at the Orange County Historical Society and the
modern ones, too. Their names are probably recognizable to many of you. First on the list will always be Terry Stevenson, Orange County's first great historian. Born in 1880, Terry grew up in Orange, was editor of the old Santa Ana Register for 20 years, and served as Santa Ana's postmaster and our county treasurer. With the sale of the Register in 1927 forcing him out of the newspaper business, there was a non-compete clause in the contract, he started writing books, and they're still some of the best books on the history of Orange County. His first, in 1930, was Caminos Viejos, which traces the early history of the area through its trails and roads. Then came his classic history of the Santa Ana Mountains, Shadows of Old Saddleback. Terry loved the Santa Ana Mountains, and that love shines through on every page. He was a wonderful, descriptive writer. He could turn the most ordinary hike into a fascinating journey. I'm told he was a very good speaker as well. He had an enthusiasm that was infectious, and he helped encourage 3 generations of Orange County historians to do their best. Terry played a vital role in the work of the Orange County Historical Society from its founding until his death in 1943. In fact, in many ways, his death marks the end of the first generation of the Historical Society. They stopped meeting that same year. The other leading historian in the early days of the Society was Bill McPherson, whose father and uncle were 2 of the biggest raisin growers in Orange County until they were wiped out by the blight soon after Bill was born in 1885. He went on to become one of the county's earliest avocado growers. You won't have read any of McPherson's books because he never wrote any, but his influence is visible on almost anything written about the history of the county in the 20s and 30s, because he had the largest library of California in the county and was always ready to share it. He spoke before the Historical Society many times and wrote a number of articles for the old Orange County History series. His book collection is now at the Honnold Library in Claremont. Beginning in the 1920s, we also find some of the next generation of Orange County historians active in the society. Leo Fries, who did so much to preserve the history of Anaheim, published his first article on Anaheim history in the third volume of our history series in 1939. He was later one of the key players in the revival of the Orange County Historical Society in 1961. He was an attorney by profession, a prolific writer, and the co-founder, with his son J.J. Fries, of the Fries Pioneer Press, which published many of our local history books in the 1960s and 70s. I met Leo Fries a couple times at the old Mother Colony History Room at the Anaheim Public Library. This was very near the end of his life, but he was still a formidable presence. But I remember that he was still interested in what a young college student like me was working on and encouraged me to take on new research projects. And you can't talk about the 1930s in Orange County history without at least mentioning the fanciful Lieutenant Alfonso Yorba. He turned his life into his own adventure story. He went by many names over the years. He said he was a Yorba, and that was the name he usually wrote under in the 1930s. In any case, he was fascinated by the Spanish and Mexican history of California and ingratiated himself to a number of the old families in San Juan Capistrano. He served in the Army during World War II, claimed he was a CIA operative, and later became, I kid you not, Postmaster General of one of the revolutionary governments in Yemen. When that government fell, he became a man without a country, having surrendered his U.S. citizenship, and he spent his last years living in Tangiers, claiming that he was a prince on the Bourbon line. You can see why I only have time to mention a guy like that. I also have to restrain myself when it comes to my old friend and mentor, Don Meadows. Born in Indiana in 1897, he grew up in Orange and became fascinated with California history at an early age. By profession, he was a teacher, botany in the early days. He was quite an expert on the Channel Islands. But his real love was always history. He was out doing research by the teens, gave his first talk before the Historical Society in 1927, on the Portola expedition, by the way, my favorite subject these days, and was in his prime in the 1960s when he published his most important book, Historic Place Names in Orange County. By then, he was living in an adobe house he'd designed himself on a hill overlooking the Santa Ana Valley. Like Bill McPherson, he'd built up an amazing library, which all of us were able to use, and all of you are able to use today because it became the backbone of the regional history collection at UC Irvine. In the early days, Don said, you were supposed to be invited to join the Orange County Historical Society, but he just showed up one night. Well, he said, a historical society is supposed to be made up of historians. It connected him with that older generation of local historians, Terry Stevenson, Bill McPherson, and others, and he then became our link back to them through the next 2 or 3 generations. Jim Sleeper always looked to Don as the dean of Orange County historians, and he was influential on people like Esther Cramer and Pamela Hallen Gibson. And as for myself, well, he was my friend and my mentor right up until he died in 1994 at age 97. He was, in turns, helpful and chiding, friendly and firm, but always supportive. That he took me seriously as a 16-year-old kid did a lot to make me who I am today. Moving on a generation, we come to the class of 1927.
They like to call themselves. That includes Bill Hendricks, the founding director of the Sherman Library, Jim Sleeper, and Esther Cramer. Jim and Esther were both presidents of the Orange County Historical Society, one after the other, in 1970 and 1971. Esther was born in La Habra and devoted more than 60 years to North County history, producing books on La Habra and Brea and an untold number of newspaper articles. She was also, incidentally, one of the first people in Orange County to do serious work in oral history, and her tapes are some of the earliest recordings in the collection at Cal State Fullerton. I know some of you knew her, and you know that she was a fireball of endless energy. Besides the Historical Society, she was a founding member of the Orange County Historical Society and the mainstay of the Orange County Pioneer Council. Again, many of you were lucky enough to know Jim Sleeper, the leading Orange County historian of his generation, and most any other generation for that matter. He was a Santa Ana boy, but his true love was the Santa Ana Mountains. He had a cabin in Holy Jim Canyon for 60 years. He was a newspaper reporter, a forest ranger, a PR man, historian for both the Irvine Company and the Mission Viejo Company, and the writer of some of the most entertaining books ever produced on the history of Orange County. A boy's book of bear stories, Turn the Rascals Out, and of course, Jim Sleeper's Almanac of Historical Oddities. You have to read them all. For those of you who didn't have a chance to meet Jim, I have good news for you. The Jim Sleeper you meet in his books was the real Jim Sleeper. He wrote like he talked, and he talked like he thought. And his mother said he'd been like that since he was 6 years old. He was, as I said before, kind of a hard man to get to know. But once you were in, he couldn't be more friendly and helpful. He had a massive library, not of books so much, but of newspaper clippings and other printed material. He had clipped his way through 60 years of the early Santa Ana newspapers, which he had purchased after they were thrown out after being microfilmed. And all that material was indexed. Hundreds of tightly typed index cards on every subject imaginable. I remember when Orange Countiana 5 came out. Jim had started Orange Countiana, by the way, when he was president. And it turned out that the Thordarson family, who started Buena Park Lumber, were from Iceland. I get to start a new card, Jim told me. Who else had an index card on Icelanders in Orange County? Since Jim's death in 2012, I've noticed a tendency among some academic scholars to write him off as merely a folk historian. I guess they've never bothered to read the 44 solid pages of endnotes and annotations in, say, Turn the Rascals Out. Some people have just never learned to tell the difference between being serious and being solemn. I could go on and on about many important Orange County historians who were a part of the Orange County Historical Society over the years, but don't worry, I won't. But I can't let this opportunity pass without mentioning at least a few more of them, and consider all of these a recommendation to read their books. I think of Ellen Lee, whose writing was as proper as she was. It's a pity she never finished her book on Helena Modjeska. No one knew more about our first international celebrity. Virginia Carpenter was no less a lady. A longtime Placentia librarian, it's no surprise that the research behind her books was always first-rate. From South County, there was Doris Walker of Dana Point, though she also did histories of San Clemente and Mission Viejo. Joe Osterman from Old El Toro, don't call it Lake Forest when Joe's around. And Pamela Hallen Gibson, Jim Sleeper liked to say that her 1975 history of San Juan Capistrano was the first book to get beyond the swallows. Steve Donaldson is our great railway historian, while Diane Marsh focused on our historic buildings as both an architectural historian and a preservationist. And a heck of an artist, I might add. Always seemed a little unfair to me that when she needed an illustration for her books, she could just draw one, and it was always beautiful. And speaking of illustrations, Ted Parker should be remembered, if only because he started the historic photo library at First American Title. One of the other things to the Orange County Historical Society's credit is that our publishing program has given many of these authors and many others a chance to share their research with a wider community. We published our first volume of the Orange County History Series in 1931, another in 1932, a third in 1939. Almost all these articles were based on talks presented at the Historical Society. In the 1960s, we started publishing booklets, and then in 1973, we launched Orange Countiana, our now annual journal of local history. There's no doubt that the writing and publishing of Orange County history has evolved over the past century. The earliest books were often long on recollections and short on research, or at least short on footnotes and bibliographies and the things that make that research available to other scholars. And as for those big old fat mug books, always remember that all those biographies in them were bought and paid for, and so only say what the families wanted said about themselves and their ancestors. Terry Stevenson, in fact, marks the transition from simply writing down stories from the old-timers, as in Shadows of Old Saddleback, to solid research in historic documents, such as his biography of Bernardo Yorba. But as Jim Sleeper liked to point out, it is the blending of the two which gives us the best books. From the old-timers, you get the life and the color of a story. From the documents, you get the dates and the details. The few city histories written before the 1960s tend to be puff pieces or just brief overviews. Serious, well-researched city histories in Orange County could be said to begin with Leroy Doig's 3-volume history of Garden Grove. Later came Esther Cramer's books on La Habra and Brea. Ed Miller did a great book on Costa Mesa, and I hope I've done my part for my hometown of Orange. But where are the solid histories of some of our South County communities, most of them over 50 years old now, or half a dozen other major cities still waiting for a book? For special subjects or more detailed aspects of various communities, we can look to the work of Leo Fries in Anaheim or Charlie Swanner in Santa Ana. I've already mentioned Steve Donaldson, whose 2-volume railroad history of Orange County, co-written with Bill Myers, is the gold standard. There are some good church histories out there and a few interesting autobiographies. Disneyland, of course, has inspired a wealth of publications, and Knott's Berry Farm less so, even if you count the many biographies of Walter Knott, none of them very strong in my opinion. On the ethnic side, we have Gilbert Gonzalez's excellent book on our Mexican-American citrus workers, labor and community, Bob Johnson's work on the Black community in Orange County, and the beginnings of work now on the Vietnamese American community here. But too many others who profess to be writing ethnic history about Orange County seem to me more intent on editorializing than educating. The same is true of some of the people who try to write political studies of Orange County. Their scholarship is often better, but they still seem to me to be lacking a real depth in their research, not seeing that the roots of our political attitudes go back long before the Goldwater campaign of 1964. While a certain detachment is necessary and objectivity is always our goal, Too much of what is written about Orange County these days strikes me as outsiders looking in. Over the decades, the Orange County Historical Society has done its best to highlight the wide range of local history, with talks on Indians, Spanish pioneers, and later Mexican immigrants. Gene Malberg spoke on the Negro community in Santa Ana as far back as 1967. In 1982, Norton Stern of the Southern California Jewish Historical Society presented a portrait of pioneer Jews in Orange County. There's also been talks on the Chinese, the Japanese, the Vietnamese, even the Basque immigrants. Many different communities have been highlighted, and we've gone beyond the historic with talks on the geology, paleontology, and archaeology of Orange County. We've looked into the fine arts, we've highlighted open space preservation, and in 1964, the Society hosted what was probably the first walking tour of historic houses in Orange County, featuring Victorian homes in Santa Ana. The first Orange County history conference, co-sponsored by the Society in 1988, included sessions on agriculture, women's clubs, civil defense during World War II, Mexican-American colonias, Vietnamese immigrants, the politics of preservation, dance in Orange County, weaving in Orange County, and local presidential elections. And we're still adding to that list. But even with 3 million people, 3 major universities, and some 30 local historical societies, most of our local history is still written by dedicated individuals working on their own steam, pursuing the projects that interest them. And there is so much more to be done. We need good books on the citrus industry, our Mexican ranchos and adobes, water, county government, the impact of World War II, the local oil industry, transportation, the fine arts, and solid biographies of some of our leading citizens. In other words, we need you. Not just as researchers and writers, but as readers and enthusiasts. As I've already pointed out, the Orange County Historical Society and its members have always offered encouragement to up-and-coming local historians. There's this strange idea floating around today that local history is somehow narrow-minded and provincial. But I would argue that it's just the opposite. Learning to care about a particular place simply because it's the place we happen to live takes us outside of ourselves and our own narrow interests. And caring about where we live simply because it's where we live is the first step toward caring about our neighbors simply because they are our neighbors. They don't have to look like us or think like us or vote like us. They're just our neighbors. We share in both the past and the present of where we live. And that can help us to find our future together. Thank you.